The sky
We
above
have to
Nexus
go
7
now.
was wrong.
What? Wait.
It
No
had
time.
always been
Run.
wrong.
Okay.
Garrett Thorne had
We have
learned
to
to
go
ignore
now.
it 7 years
What?
ago,
Wait.
the way a
No
man
time.
learns
Run.
to ignore
Okay.
the ache of old wounds. The atmosphere here refracted light through layers of metallic particulate, turning sunsets into bruised purples and sickly greens that would make a normal man's stomach turn. But Garrett wasn't a normal man anymore. He was a salvager, a ghost haunting the graveyard of dead ships. The plasma cutter in his scarred hands hissed as it bit into the hull of an ancient frigate. Sparks cascaded down like dying stars. The metal groaned its surrender, and Garrett felt that familiar satisfaction, the kind that came from understanding something broken well enough to take it apart. Understanding was control. Control was survival. These were the truths that had kept him breathing through 7 long years of solitude in the Arizona Badlands. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, the kind of precision that spoke of military training never quite forgotten. Former Navy combat engineer. The words felt like they belonged to someone else now. Someone who died in that accident, along with his entire squad. Garrett had survived. Sometimes he wondered if that was the cruelest joke the universe could play. The fusion core he was extracting hummed with residual power. Dangerous work. One wrong cut and he'd be vapor. But Garrett's hands never shook. They'd forgotten how. He'd forgotten a lot of things out here in the scrapyard. How to trust. How to hope. How to care about anything beyond the next salvage, the next meal, the next sunrise over fields of broken metal. The work was meditation. Cut. Extract. Catalog. Repeat. Day after day after day. It was enough. It had to be enough. Then the sky tore open. Garrett's head snapped up at the sound. Not the usual groan of settling wreckage or the whine of distant wind through steel canyons. This was something else. Something that bypassed his conscious mind and went straight to combat instincts he'd thought were long dead. His plasma cutter clattered to the deck plating as his body moved before his brain caught up. The burning streak carved across that poisoned sky like a wound growing larger by the second. A ship, coming down hard and fast, its stabilizers venting plasma in desperate bursts that painted the air in shades of blue-white desperation. Garrett's mind, trained for crisis, began calculating automatically. Trajectory, impact zone, blast radius. The numbers scrolled through his consciousness with mechanical precision. His legs pumped harder, boots clanging against the rusted deck plating of the ancient frigate's spine. 7 years of solitude hadn't dulled his reflexes. If anything, the constant danger of the scrapyard had honed them sharper. He vaulted over a twisted bulkhead, landing in a crouch that would have made his old drill instructor nod approval. The ship was a beauty even in its death spiral. An Aurora-class luxury liner, all elegant swan-like curves and polished hull that spoke of wealth beyond Garrett's comprehension. The kind of ship that ferried empresses and oligarchs between star systems in climate-controlled comfort. The kind of ship that had no business being anywhere near a scrap field like Nexus 7. It hit the ground like the fist of an angry god. The impact sent a shockwave rippling through miles of stacked wreckage. The world became sound and fury. Garrett was thrown forward, his body remembering how to fall, how to roll with momentum instead of fighting it. He came up in a crouch as debris rained around him like apocalyptic hail. Chunks of hull plating, shattered titanium struts. The detritus of disaster. The Aurora's dawn. He could see the name now on a piece of hull that had sheared clean off, had carved a smoking trench through the steel canyons. Its hull was split open like overripe fruit, spilling its guts across the scrapyard. Fires raged inside, fed by oxygen and fuel and the 1,000 flammable things that made up a starship's innards. Garrett should have walked away. Every survival instinct screamed at him to wait for the core to stabilize, then pick through the remains when it was safe. That was the salvager's way, the smart way, the way that kept you breathing. But through the smoke and flame, he heard it. A sound that bypassed his brain and went straight to something older, something primal, something he'd thought the scrapyard had burned out of him. Someone was screaming, not the mechanical shriek of tortured metal. Human, or close enough to human that his body responded before his mind could object. Garrett vaulted over a twisted bulkhead and dove into the inferno. The heat was immediate and suffocating. His salvager's jumpsuit had thermal lining, but it could only do so much against the furnace the crash had created. Sweat flash-boiled on his skin, The air itself felt solid, pressing against his lungs like a physical weight. He yanked his breather mask up, squinting through smoke that turned the world into shifting shadows painted in shades of orange and black. Emergency lighting flickered red inside the dying ship, casting everything in hellish illumination, the kind of light that belonged in nightmares. Garrett moved deeper, following the sound of that voice. His boots crunched on shattered crystal, probably from some luxury viewport. Blood on the deck plating, still wet, still red. Someone was alive in here. Someone needed help. There. Movement beneath a collapsed support beam, and she was magnificent. Even in ruin, even pinned and bleeding, she was the most striking thing Garrett had seen in 7 years of gray solitude. Her skin was covered in fine fur the color of orange and gold like sunset on a world that didn't poison its sky. Silver hair matted with blood and soot. But what caught his attention, what made his breath stop in his chest, was her tail. Massive and bushy, pinned beneath half a ton of wreckage. The fur was the same orange gold as her body, but the tip was pure white, and somehow impossibly luminescent even in the fire's glow. It twitched in agony, and Garrett felt an answering pain in his chest that he couldn't explain. Their eyes met. Hers were amber, impossibly large, wide with pain and something else. Something that looked like recognition, which was impossible because Garrett had never seen her before in his life. Had never seen anything like her before. Not human. The pointed mobile ears that swiveled toward him made that clear, but close enough that it mattered. "Hold on," Garrett shouted, though he doubted she could hear him over the roar of the flames. The support beam was too heavy to lift. Garrett's eyes, trained to assess salvage, scanned the wreckage with desperate speed. The ship's fusion core was making sounds that meant he had maybe 90 seconds before this whole section became a new sun. 90 seconds to do the impossible. 60 seconds. He spotted a hydraulic jack half buried in debris, grabbed it, jammed it under the beam, and started pumping. The mechanism groaned. The beam lifted an inch, 2 inches. Not enough. Not nearly enough. 45 seconds. The woman was saying something, her lips moving frantically. Warning him, telling him to leave her, telling him to save himself. The words were in a language Garrett didn't understand, but the meaning was crystal clear. He ignored her. 30 seconds. There was no time. No time for the jack, no time for clever engineering solutions, no time for anything except the most desperate measure. Garrett did the only thing he could think of. He reached down, wrapped both hands around the base of her tail where it met her body, and pulled. The effect was immediate and electric. She gasped a sound that was equal parts shock and something else, something that made the hair on the back of Garrett's neck stand up. Her whole body went rigid, back arching, and for a horrible moment he thought he had hurt her worse, that he'd broken something crucial, that he'd killed her trying to save her. But then she was moving, scrambling forward with desperate, impossible strength, and Garrett was hauling backward, his hands full of her tail, thick and soft and impossibly warm against his scarred palms. The texture was unlike anything he'd ever felt, velvet over steel, living warmth that sent sensation racing up his arms and into his chest, where it detonated like a shaped charge against his heart. 15 seconds. They tumbled together through a jagged tear in the hull. Garrett threw himself over her, shielding her body with his wrapping himself around her, as the Aurora's Dawn's core detonated behind them. The world became light and heat and thunder. Reality itself seemed to fracture. Sound became touch. Light became pressure. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. When sensation returned to something approaching normal, Garrett realized 2 things. First, he was alive. Against all odds, against all reason, his heart was still beating. Air was still moving in and out of his lungs. The scrapyard hadn't claimed him yet. Second, the woman beneath him was trembling. Not with fear, not with pain, with something that made his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with the near-death experience they just survived. Her hands fisted in his jumpsuit, her face pressed against his chest, and she was whispering words in that alien language, the tone carrying meaning even when the words didn't. Garrett rolled off her, every muscle in his body groaning protest. "You hurt." She stared at him with those impossible amber eyes. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her breathing fast and shallow. When she spoke, her voice was accented with something he couldn't place, musical and precise, like each word was chosen with care. "You pulled my tail. Yeah, Garrett said, checking himself for injuries. Nothing major. Burns that would blister, bruises that would ache, but functional. Sorry about that. It was the only way to the soul anchor, she whispered, and now there was wonder in her voice. Hunger and something that made his skin prickle with awareness he didn't understand. You invoked the NRA. The soul claim? Look, Garrett said, uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. I don't know what. She lunged forward, not attacking. Garrett's combat instincts registered that immediately. But the movement was so sudden, so intense, that his body tensed anyway. She buried her face against his chest, her hands fisting in his jumpsuit with surprising strength, and whispered words in a language he didn't understand. But he understood the tone. He'd heard it before in combat and crisis, in those moments when people bonded beyond reason, beyond logic, in the crucible of shared survival. Hey, he said softly, awkwardly, patting her shoulder because he didn't know what else to do. It's okay. You're safe now, she laughed. Actually laughed. A sound like silver bells in hell, bright and beautiful and completely incongruous with the devastation surrounding them. Safe, she said, pulling back just enough to look at him. Oh, salvager, I am anything but safe. The woman sat on a chunk of hull, plating her posture, somehow regal despite the shredded gown and soot-streaked fur. Up close in the gray light of Nexus 7's perpetual twilight, Garrett could appreciate the alienness of her. The way her orange-gold fur caught what little light there was and seemed to glow from within. The delicate bone structure of her face, so like a human woman's, but refined, sharpened, made somehow more. The ears that swiveled independently, tracking sounds he couldn't hear. And that tail, magnificent, even singed and dirty, it lay curled protectively around her legs. The white tip still faintly luminescent, pulsing with some inner light that Garrett didn't understand. I am Silvera Night Whisper, she said, and even through exhaustion, her voice carried weight. Authority, the kind of presence that came from being born to command. Empress of the Vulpine hegemony, sovereign of the 12 systems. Keeper of Garrett, he interrupted, already inventorying his gear. Thorn, salvager, keeper of whatever I can carry, her ears flicked. Annoyance, amusement, both. He couldn't read alien body language well enough to tell. You have no idea what you've done, do you, she asked. Saved your life. He was checking his plasma cutter. Toast. The kinetic pistol at his hip still looked functional, though. Pretty sure that's what happened. You grabbed my tail. She said it slowly, like explaining quantum mechanics to a child. During a life or death moment, without permission, without hesitation. Again, sorry, but time was kind of a factor. Silvara stood, and despite everything, despite the crash and the fire and the near death, she moved with liquid grace. She approached him close enough that he could smell her through the smoke. Something sweet and wild like cinnamon and thunder, and things that didn't have names in any human language. In my culture, she said quietly, the tail is sacred. It is the spiritual anchor, the seat of the soul. To be forcibly taken by the tail, to have one's life saved through such contact. She reached out and placed her hand over his heart. Even through the thick material of his jumpsuit, her touch burned. Seared through fabric and skin, straight down to something deeper. It invokes the Inara, she continued. The soul claim. Garrett stepped back, frowning. Look, Your Majesty or whatever. I don't do magic. I do salvage repairs and occasionally shooting people who try to steal my salvage. Whatever spiritual thing you think happened. Touch me, she interrupted. What? Touch me, she repeated, holding out her hand. Anywhere. Just make contact. Against his better judgment, and his better judgment had kept him alive in some truly awful situations, Garrett reached out and took her hand. Her palm was warm against his. Smaller than his scarred paw, but strong. He could feel calluses there, the kind that came from weapons training. This Empress wasn't soft. The world shifted. It wasn't visual, wasn't audible. But Garrett felt it as surely as he'd felt the explosion. A connection snapping into place like a magnetic lock engaging, like a circuit completing, like two halves of something clicking together with a rightnesses that defied explanation. He could feel her pulse, rapid and strong, could sense her exhaustion layered over pain, layered over something vast and hungry that made his mouth go dry. It was like standing too close to a fusion reactor. All that power barely contained humming just beneath the surface. He jerked his hand back. The connection dimmed but didn't disappear. It thrummed in his chest, a new awareness sitting right next to his heartbeat. He could still feel her. Not physically, but there. Present, real, undeniable. Silvara smiled, and there was triumph in it, and desire and satisfaction that seemed almost predatory. "You feel it now, don't you?" she asked. "The bond, I am claimed salvager. Your instinct to save me, your disregard for protocol, your strength." Her tail swished behind her, agitated, the white tip leaving trails of faint light in the air. "I am yours until this is broken, or you release me. And already I can feel what you won't admit." "Oh yeah," Garrett asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "What's that?" She leaned in, her breath hot against his ear, and whispered, "That you want me too." He wanted to deny it, wanted to laugh it off as alien nonsense. But when she leaned in like that, when her breath touched his skin and that sweet wild scent filled his lungs, his body responded in ways that had nothing to do with conscious thought. 7 years of self-imposed isolation. 7 years of denying himself any connection deeper than transactions with other scavengers. 7 years of carefully maintained emotional numbness. And this alien empress, with her impossible eyes and her sacred tail, was threatening to crack it all wide open with nothing more than proximity and truth. "We should move," Garrett said roughly, stepping back before he did something monumentally stupid. "That explosion will draw attention. And I'm guessing someone wanted you dead if that crash wasn't an accident." The hunger in Silvara's eyes dim, replaced by cold calculation that spoke of intelligence beyond the physical. "You're right. The Aurora's Dawn was supposed to be the most secure vessel in my fleet. For it to fail so catastrophically, someone got to it." Garrett was already scanning the horizon, looking for signs of movement. The scrapyard was never truly empty. Scavengers, automated defense systems left by long-dead salvagers, worse things sometimes, which means they'll send people to confirm the kill. "We need to get off this field," Silvara said, understanding immediately. "Get somewhere defensible." "My bunker," Garrett said, already plotting the route in his mind. 3 clicks north through the steel canyons. "Can you walk?" "I was a duelist before I was an empress," she replied, and there was steel in her voice now. Pride. "I can keep pace." "Then follow me." She did. But as they started moving through the wreckage, Garrett noticed something strange. Silvara wasn't just following him. She was staying exactly 2 steps behind. Not beside him, not ranging independently like a trained soldier would. 2 steps back, constant, precise, like she was tethered to him by an invisible cord. "What are you doing?" he asked, after the 3rd time he stopped, and she stopped exactly 2 seconds later. "Following," she said simply. "The bond compels me to stay near my savior." That's Garrett's search for the word. Creepy, inconvenient, potentially tactically unsound. "That's the Inara," Silvara replied. And was that amusement in her voice? "You pulled an empress from wreckage by her tail. Did you expect there would be no consequences?" The steel canyons were a maze of wreckage. Cruisers stacked on destroyers, stacked on freighters, creating artificial ravines that stretched for miles. Shadows within shadows. Darkness at noon. Garrett had mapped most of the local area over years of salvage runs. He knew which paths were stable and which would collapse under weight. Knew where ancient automated defenses still lurked. Knew every shortcut and dead end within 5 miles of his bunker. Silvara followed him with surprising agility. Her tail streamed behind her like a battle standard, that white tip leaving faint tracers in the gloom. Despite the heels of her ornate boots, what remained of them, she kept pace. She used her tail for balance as they climbed over debris, counterweighting her movements with unconscious grace. "You move well," Garrett commented, helping her over a particularly nasty gap. "For royalty, I was a duelist before I was an empress," she repeated. There was something wistful in her tone. "The court may have softened me with luxury, but I remember my training." They dropped into a ravine formed by 2 massive cargo haulers leaning against each other. The shadows here were deep, the air cooler. Garrett paused, listening. Combat engineering had taught him to trust his instincts. Right now, those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. "This place is alive," Silvara murmured, her ears swiveling, tracking sounds. "I can hear it breathing." "It's thermal expansion," Garrett explained absently, still scanning their surroundings. "When the sun sets, everything contracts. Creates sounds like..." He stopped. That wasn't thermal expansion. The motion sensor was ancient, probably installed decades ago by some long-dead salvager protecting their territory. But ancient or not, once triggered, the magnetic mines it controlled were still very much functional. Garrett had learned to read the signs. Scratch marks on hull plating and where equipment had been dragged. Subtle discoloration where magnetic fields had interfered with the natural oxidation process. He grabbed Silvara and pulled her against the hull wall, pressing them both flat. His body covering hers, protective instinct overriding tactical sense. She gasped at the contact and he felt her heart rate spike. Felt something else too. Something heated and electric that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the way their bodies fit together. 3 spheres floated past, each the size of a human head, their surfaces covered in sensor arrays and weapon ports. Red activation lights blinked in sequence. Hunting patterns, seeking movement, seeking heat, seeking any excuse to detonate and take intruders with them. One passed close enough that Garrett could see his reflection in its polished surface. Close enough that Silvara's breath was hot against his neck. Close enough that he could feel her heartbeat through the point where their chests pressed together. Or was that his own heart? The bond made it hard to tell where she ended and he began. The mines floated on their sensors, sweeping the ravine, finding nothing. Garrett waited a full 30 seconds after they disappeared before releasing Silvara. She stayed pressed against him for a moment longer than necessary. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated. He could feel her adrenaline mixing with something else. Something that made his pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with near-death experiences. "How did you know?" she whispered. Scratch marks on the hull, Garrett pointed them out. Barely visible grooves in the oxidized metal. "Someone dragged equipment through here, probably to set the trap. You learned to read the scrap." He demonstrated, pointing out the signs. Then, because the mines were gone and the path ahead needed to be cleared, he showed her how to spot tripwires. How to identify unstable plating by the pattern of rust. How to test weight distribution before crossing a gap. How to survive in this metal hell he called home. And Silvara, Empress of the Vulpine hegemony, sovereign of the 12 systems, watched with rapt attention. "In my court," she said as they navigated around a collapsed engine assembly, "everything is automated. Doors open before you reach them. Temperatures adjust to your preference before you feel discomfort. The path lights before you take a step." She paused, her tail swishing thoughtfully. "I haven't had to think about my environment in years. Haven't had to read anything, assess anything, survive anything. Everything is done for me, decided for me, controlled for me." "Sounds boring," Garrett said. She laughed, bright and genuine. "It was. I didn't realize how boring until I watched you read this wreckage like a book. Like every scratch and stain tells a story. Like the metal itself is speaking to you." Her tail brushed against his leg. Accident or intention? The touch sent electricity racing up his nervous system, and he felt her awareness of his reaction. Felt her satisfaction at it. "There's something deeply compelling about competence," she said softly. Garrett didn't know what to say to that, so he focused on the path. They were making good time. Another hour and they'd reach the bunker. Another hour and they'd have walls and defenses, and the shot came from above, punching through a metal plate inches from his head. Down Garrett tackled Silvara behind a bulkhead as more shots followed. The whine of plasma fire filling the ravine, superheating air turning the world into a storm of ionized particles and death. He drew his kinetic pistol, popped up long enough to identify the shooter. Lone figure perched 100 meters up, using a cargo crane as a sniper's nest. Not professional. The stance was wrong, the timing off. Probably a scavenger who'd seen Silvara's fine clothes and thought payday. "Stay here," Garrett ordered. Like hell, Silvara shot back. But he was already moving, using the terrain like he'd been born to it. Plasma fire tracked him, always a second too slow. The scavenger was good with the rifle, but terrible with tactics. He was thinking like a marksman, not like a hunter. Predictable. Garrett reached a support straw, climbed in it with brutal efficiency, came up behind the shooter from an angle they weren't expecting. The scavenger was heavily modded with cheap cybernetics, metal replacing flesh in a patchwork that spoke of desperation and pain. He turned, raising his plasma rifle. Garrett shot him twice. The kinetic rounds punched through the scavenger's energy shield like it wasn't there. Because energy shields didn't stop physical matter. They never had. The man, if you could still call him that under all the modifications, went down hard. Hit the crane platform, didn't get up. When Garrett returned to Silvera, she was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between awe and hunger and calculation. What he asked, checking her over. No new injuries. Good. You move like a predator, she said softly. I've seen warriors, seen champions, seen soldiers who'd conquered planets. But that was hunting. Pure and efficient and utterly without hesitation. Combat engineering, Garrett said, uncomfortable with her intensity. You learn to use the environment or you die. He checked her over more thoroughly, his hands professional but thorough, looking for wounds he might have missed in the chaos. You okay? I'm not fragile, Garrett. But she didn't pull away from his hands. If anything, she leaned into the contact, her eyes half closing. Though I'm beginning to understand why the Anara chooses who it chooses. Still not buying the magic, Garrett muttered. Then explain why. I can feel your adrenaline fading, Silvara said. Her hand found his chest right over his heart, and the touch was deliberate now. Claiming, why I knew you were safe before you came back into view, why I could feel your focus, your calculation, your absolute certainty that you would win. Her other hand came up to cup his face, claws retracted, but present a reminder that she was as dangerous as she was beautiful. Explain why touching you feels like coming home to a place I've never been. Garrett had no answer for that. The bond hummed between them, that strange connection that defied his understanding of physics and biology and every rational thing he'd built his life around. So instead of answering, instead of trying to rationalize the irrational, he took her hand and pulled her forward. Come on, he said gruffly. We need to keep moving. But as they walked, her fingers laced through his and he found he didn't want to let go. Found that the connection wasn't just in his chest anymore. It was in the way their steps synchronized, in the way she anticipated his movements and he anticipated hers, in the way the silence between them felt comfortable instead of awkward. 7 years of solitude, 7 years of carefully maintained distance, and this alien empress was dismantling it all in the space of hours. The storm hit without warning. One moment the air was clear, the next a wall of metallic dust whipped into a frenzy. By thermal winds turned the world into chaos. Visibility dropped to zero. The wind shrieked through the steel canyons like a living thing, angry and hungry and utterly indifferent to whether they lived or died. Emergency shelter, Garrett shouted over the howl, but he could barely hear himself. The dust was already infiltrating his breather mask, grating against his teeth, coating his lungs with microscopic particles of metal that could strip flesh from bone given enough time. There, Silvera pointed with her tail, and somehow through the maelstrom, Garrett spotted it. A maintenance hatch half buried in debris. Ancient, probably hadn't been opened in decades, but it represented their only chance. He got the hatch open through sheer stubbornness, his muscles screaming protest, his hands leaving bloody smears on the metal. They tumbled inside as the storm intensified, becoming a howling beast that scoured the landscape with the fury of a planet that had never wanted humans here in the first place. The shelter was tiny, barely large enough for both of them. Some long-dead maintenance crew's bolt hole forgotten by time and circumstance. It had a functioning atmosphere recycler, the soft hum of working machinery, a miracle in this graveyard. The structural integrity seemed solid, but it also forced them into immediate, unavoidable proximity. Garrett's back was against the wall. Silvara was pressed against his chest. Her tail curled around both of them, that white tip glowing in the dim emergency lighting, providing the only illumination in their tiny refuge. In that soft glow, he could see every detail of her face. The way her fur caught the light, each strand distinct. The flecks of gold in her amber eyes. The soft curve of her lips. The delicate architecture of her alien beauty. Well, she said, slightly breathless. This is intimate. Storm should pass in an hour or two, Garrett said, trying to keep his voice level, professional, distant. We just need to, He stopped, because he could feel her heartbeat. Not just hear it, not just sense it through that strange bond, actually feel it like his own pulse had synchronized with hers, like they were sharing the same rhythm, the same breath, the same moment stretched out into eternity. She noticed too, her eyes widened, pupils dilating until the amber was just a thin ring around darkness. The bond is strengthening, she whispered. That's not possible, Garrett said. It's just adrenaline. close quarters, stress response. Garrett, she placed both hands on his chest and the sensation was overwhelming. He felt what she felt. The warmth of his body so much hotter than her kind radiating through her like a furnace. The solid strength of him, all hard muscle and old scars so different from the refined courtiers she'd known. The smell of him metal and sweat and something fundamentally human that her body recognized and responded to on a level deeper than thought. And beneath it all, desire. Hers, his, intertwined until he couldn't tell which was which. I can feel what you won't say, she whispered. Your attraction, your confusion about it, the way you keep trying to rationalize what's between us, the way your body responds even as your mind builds walls. This is insane, Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. We just met. You're an empress. I'm a salvager. This is just shock and proximity. And you're mine, Silvara interrupted, and the possessiveness in her voice was almost feral. The Anara has chosen. My body knows it. My soul knows it. Her tail tightened around them, pulling them even closer together. And unless I'm completely misreading this bond, your body knows it too. She was right. They both knew it. The proximity, the bond, the rush of survival. It all combined into something undeniable, something that made Garrett's carefully maintained control feel like a dam with cracks spreading through its foundation. Tell me about your court, Garrett, I said, desperately trying to derail the moment before he did something they'd both regret. Or wouldn't regret. That was the problem. Your people. How does this claim work in your culture? Silvara studied him for a long moment. Then she settled more comfortably against him, her body molding to his like they were designed to fit together. If she noticed the effect she was having, she gave no sign. Or maybe she did notice and simply didn't care. The Anara is ancient. She began her voice taking on the cadence of storytelling of history passed down through generations. Before we had empires, before we reached the stars, before we were anything more than prey animals running from predators on a world that wanted us dead. Her ears drooped slightly, a gesture that seemed unconscious, vulnerable. My people survived through cunning and speed, yes, but also through bonding. When one of us was saved from certain death, through contact with the tail, the soul anchor, a bond would form. The saved would belong to their savior. Body and soul, until death or release. That's archaic, Garrett said. Yes. Silvera's tail swished the white tip, leaving faint trails of light, which is why it was forbidden centuries ago. Too many abuses, too much potential for coercion, too much power given to those who would exploit it. She looked up at him, and the vulnerability in her expression was startling. This was an empress, a sovereign of 12 star systems, and she was looking at him like he held all the answers to questions she'd forgotten how to ask. I never thought I'd experience it, she said softly. The Anara was something from history, from the old tales. I'm empress. I command fleets. I negotiate treaties that span light years. I hold the fates of billions in my hands. A pause, heavy with meaning. And yet here we are. Here we are, Garrett echoed. The storm raged outside. Inside, the temperature was climbing. The shelter's thermal regulators struggling with the heat Garrett's human metabolism generated. Silvara's fur was sleek with perspiration, and when she shifted against him unconsciously, seeking the coolness of the metal wall at his back, Garrett had to bite back a sound that was half groan, half surrender. You're so warm, she murmured, her voice drowsy, hypnotic. My kind, we run cold. The court is kept at temperatures that would freeze a human solid. But this, she pressed closer, shameless in her need for the heat he provided. This is intoxicating. Silvara, Garrett's voice was rough. I think I know what you're going to say, she interrupted. That we should wait. That this is too fast. That you don't understand the bond. That I'm an empress and you're a salvager, and there are 1,000 reasons why this is complicated. Her tail unwound slightly, the tip tracing up his arm with deliberate sensuality. But I can feel your desire, Garrett. Through this bond that you don't believe in. It matches my own. And the Anara doesn't lie. Can't lie. It shows us truth whether we want to see it or not. I don't want to take advantage, Garrett said. She laughed, bright and genuine and utterly without fear. Take advantage of an empress who could command your death with a word, who is stronger than you, faster than you, and has claws. She demonstrated, extending her fingers to show the retractable claws hidden there. Sharp, deadly, beautiful. I am claim salvager. But I am not helpless. I am not weak. I am not some fragile thing to be protected from my own desires. She leaned in, her breath hot against his mouth. If I kiss you now, it's because I choose to. Not because of the bond. Not because you saved me. But because when I look at you, when I feel what you feel, I see a man worth claiming back. And she did. The kiss was electric, her lips soft and seeking. Garrett's hands found her waist, and the feel of fur over lean muscle of her tail wrapping around his wrist, of her small sound of satisfaction, obliterated any remaining resistance. 7 years of self-imposed isolation shattered like glass. 7 years of careful distance burned away like morning fog. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Silvara smiled with unmistakable satisfaction. The bond, she whispered against his mouth, is definitely strengthening. The storm howled outside their tiny refuge. But inside, wrapped in each other's warmth, something new was being forged. Something that transcended species and circumstance, and every rational objection Garrett's mind could manufacture. He'd pulled an empress from Wreckage by her tail, and she was claiming him right back. The storm cleared as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving the scrapyard scoured clean and glittering with fresh metal exposed to Nexus 7's poison sky. Garrett helped Silvara from the shelter, his hands lingering on her waist longer than strictly necessary. She could feel his awareness of the contact, his satisfaction at it, his reluctance to break away. They still had 2 miles to the bunker. 2 miles through terrain that had been transformed by the metallic tempest into something unfamiliar and treacherous. But Garrett's internal map adjusted automatically, reading the new landscape the way another man might read a book. Silvara followed exactly 2 steps behind him. Not beside. Not ranging to the flanks like a soldier would. 2 steps back, constant, imprecise, like she was tethered to him by something invisible and unbreakable. Her tail swished behind her, that luminescent white tip, leaving faint tracers in the twilight. Every time Garrett stopped to assess their route, she stopped exactly 2 seconds later. Every time he turned, she turned. A shadow made flesh and fur and impossible amber eyes. "You're doing it again," Garrett said, doing what Silvara's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Following me like—" He searched for the right comparison. "Like a duckling following its mother." "The bond compels proximity," she said simply. "I must stay near my savior. It's not conscious choice. It simply is." "That doesn't bother you, being compelled." Silvara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "In my court, I'm compelled by duty, by tradition, by the weight of 12 systems looking to me for leadership I never asked for. This," her tail brushed his leg deliberately, "this compulsion feels like freedom." Garrett didn't know what to say to that, so he focused on the path, on survival, and the practical concerns that had kept him breathing for 7 years in this metal graveyard. But her words settled into his chest, right next to where the bond hummed its constant awareness of her presence. They reached the bunker as Nexus 7's sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and sickly green. The structure was everything Garrett had promised. A hollowed-out cruiser engine 3 stories tall, modified over years into something between fortress and home. Automated turrets tracked their approach, sophisticated enough to recognize Garrett's biometrics, crude enough that they'd turn anything else into vapor. "Impressive," Silvara said, studying the defenses with a tactical eye that reminded Garrett she'd been a warrior before she'd been royalty. "How long did this take to build?" 7 years, Garrett replied, keying in the access code. "Little bit every day. Salvage and survival." The entrance was a maze of trapped corridors, each turn potentially lethal to anyone who didn't know the pattern. Pressure plates that would trigger plasma charges. Motion sensors linked to automated guns. A final airlock that scanned for foreign biologics and would incinerate anything it didn't recognize. Garrett added Silvara's genetic signature to the whitelist, trying not to think about what that meant. About permanence. About planning for a future that included her. His hands were steady on the console, but she could probably feel the turmoil underneath. The bunker's interior was Spartan by any standard, probably freezing by Imperial ones. But it was clean, functional, safe. 3 levels connected by metal stairs. The top level held surveillance equipment and weapons storage. The middle level was living quarters, a space that managed to be both cramped and efficient. The bottom level housed the fusion generator and water reclamation systems that kept Garrett alive. It's perfect, Silvera said, and he felt that she meant it. Felt that she saw past the bare metal walls and utilitarian furniture to something else, to sanctuary, to a place built by someone who understood survival at its most fundamental level. Make yourself comfortable, Garrett said, already moving to the communication array. I need to set up that signal to your admiral. Corza Silvara supplied, following him to the console. Not 2 steps behind now. Right beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. Admiral Corza Steelheart. She's been my friend since we were cubs. If anyone in the fleet is loyal, it's her. She rattled off encryption codes from memory, her voice steady despite the exhaustion he could feel pulsing between them. He input the data, his fingers flying over keys with practiced efficiency. The long-range transmitter was cobbled together from salvaged parts, but it was solid work. It would reach orbit, it would punch through interference, it would get the message out. If Admiral Corza was listening, if she wasn't part of whatever conspiracy had brought the Aurora's dawn screaming from the sky. Done, Garrett said, leaning back from the console. Message is on loop, encrypted. If she's out there, she'll hear it. And if she's not, Silvera asked quietly, then we hold out until the mercenaries run out of patience or ammunition, whichever comes first. Garrett turned to find Silvera watching him with an expression that made his breath catch. There was gratitude there, yes, but also something deeper. Something hungry and certain and utterly without shame. Thank you, she said softly, for all of this, for saving me, for protecting me, for not treating me like fragile royalty who needs to be shielded from reality. You're not fragile, Garrett said. The plasma graze on her shoulder had been cleaned and bandaged, but he could see other wounds now. Bruises darkening beneath her fur, cuts from shattered crystal, evidence of survival, hard won. You've kept up with me through hell. Most trained soldiers couldn't have done that. The bond helps, Silvera admitted. I can feel your confidence. It steadies me, gives me strength I didn't know I had. Her tail curled around his wrist, the gesture intimate in ways that had nothing to do with the physical contact. He felt the deliberateness of it, the claiming, the promise. But it's more than that, she continued. You see me, Garrett, not Empress Silvara Night Whisper, not the sovereign of 12 systems, not the ceremonial figurehead who sits on a throne and makes pronouncements written by advisors. She stepped closer until there was no space between them at all. Just me. And that's worth more than you could possibly know. The bunker's main room was lit by emergency lighting, casting everything in warm amber that made Silvera's fur seem to glow from within. Outside, night was falling on Nexus 7, bringing with it the cold that would make the metal contract and groan like a living thing. They had hours before the mercenaries could regroup, hours before the next assault, hours before reality came crashing back in. Hours alone. Silvera stood, and there was intention in every movement. She reached behind her back, found the clasp of her ruined gown, and let it fall. Underneath her body was a revelation. Athletic curves covered in that fine orange-gold fur. Lean muscle that spoke of training and discipline and strength, carefully maintained. Her tail swished behind her, and Garrett realized with a jolt that the white tip was luminescent, in the low light pulsing with some inner rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The Anara bond, she said, stepping closer, only strengthens with acceptance, with consummation. Her hands found the clasps of his jumpsuit, clever fingers working the fastenings with surprising dexterity. I know this is fast. I know it defies logic. I know there are 1,000 reasons to wait. The jumpsuit parted, and her hands explored the planes of his chest with clear appreciation, tracing old scars, mapping the landscape of a body built by hard work and harder survival. But through this bond, I've felt your heart, Garrett Thorne, your honor, your strength, your loneliness that mirrors my own. She looked up at him, and the vulnerability in her expression stole his breath. And I want you, not because of the bond, not because you saved me, but because when I look at you, when I feel what you feel, I see a man worth claiming. Garrett caught her hands, held them gently. Once we do this, there's no going back. The bond becomes permanent, right? Yes, Silvera said simply. And you're okay with that, with being bound to a salvager, with the political nightmare that's going to create? She smiled, soft and genuine, and utterly without fear. I'm an Empress, Garrett. I've spent my life making impossible decisions, choosing between bad options and worse ones. balancing the needs of billions against the demands of reality. She freed one hand, placed it over his heart, and he felt her absolute certainty. This is the easiest decision I've ever made. The kiss was different this time. Deeper, more certain. No more hesitation, no more walls. Garrett's hands found her waist, pulling her close, and the feel of her against him, all warmth and softness and strength, obliterated any remaining doubt. They moved together toward the sleeping quarters, a tangle of limbs and desperate touches. Silvara's claws traced his shoulders, careful not to break skin, but present enough to remind him of what she was, what she could be. Garrett's hands explored the landscape of her body, learning the places that made her gasp, made her tail curl tight, made small sounds escape her throat. When they finally came together, the bond exploded into full life. Garrett felt everything. Her pleasure sharp and building like electricity in his nervous system. Her desire vast and hungry and utterly focused on him. The overwhelming rightness she felt in this moment, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place after a lifetime of not quite fitting. And she felt him. The depth of his attraction, no longer hidden behind walls of careful control. The protectiveness that had driven him to save her, that now drove him to cherish her. The growing emotion he hadn't wanted to name, but could no longer deny. They moved as one, the bond guiding them, teaching them each other's needs without words. Silvara's strength surprised him. Her vulpine nature giving her endurance that left him breathless speed that matched his own desperate intensity. And his human heat, his raw physical presence, drove her to heights she'd never imagined, burning away the cold that had lived in her bones for longer than she cared to remember. When they finally collapsed together, sweat slicked and satisfied, the bond settled into something permanent. A connection that would last until death, woven into the fabric of who they were at the most fundamental level. Well, Silvera murmured against his chest, her tail wrapped possessively around his leg. That was definitely worth starting a political incident. Garrett laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. Pretty sure we've done more than start an incident. We've probably caused an interstellar crisis. Good. She propped herself up on one elbow, looking at him with unmistakable affection. I was getting bored with conventional politics anyway. Outside, the wind howled across the scrapyard. Somewhere in the distance, engines thrummed, the mercenaries regrouping, preparing for another assault. The universe didn't care that two people had found something precious in the wreckage. It would demand its due soon enough. But inside the bunker, wrapped in each other, Garrett and Silvera had found something neither had expected. A connection that transcended species status and circumstance. Something worth fighting for, worth surviving for, worth everything. Morning came too soon, dragging with it the cold reality of their situation. Garrett woke to find Silvera pressed against him, seeking his warmth even in sleep. Her tail was wrapped around his waist, and he could feel her dreams. Fragmentary images of running through forests that didn't exist on Nexus 7, of hunting with others of her kind, of a life before crowns and courts and the crushing weight of responsibility. He tried to slip from the bed without waking her, made it approximately 3 feet before she stirred her ears, swiveling toward him, even before her eyes opened. Where are you going? Her voice was sleepy but alert. Monitors, Garrett said. Need to check what's coming? I'll join you. You should rest. But she was already rising, moving with that grace that made even exhaustion look elegant. And she followed him, not just to the monitors, everywhere. When he went to check the weapons cache, she was 2 steps behind. When he moved to the water reclamation system, she shadowed him. When he climbed to the surveillance level, her footsteps echoed his on the metal stairs. You really can't help it, can you? Garrett asked, not unkindly. The bond pulls me to you, Silvera admitted. Everywhere you go, I must be near. It's not uncomfortable. Actually, it's rather, she searched for the word, comforting, like I'm tethered to something solid in a universe that's proven itself untrustworthy. Garrett pulled up the external cameras, scanning the perimeter. What he saw made his blood run cold. 20 mercenaries, fresh troops in full combat armor, not the ragtag scavengers from yesterday. Energy weapons gleaming, and hovering above them a gunship. Not the sleek interceptor from yesterday. This was a bombardment-class vessel, bristling with enough firepower to level a city block. They're not messing around, Garrett muttered. Silvera leaned over his shoulder, her presence a warm comfort, even as dreads settled in his gut. He felt her shift from sleepy contentment to cold tactical assessment in the space of a heartbeat. The Shadowfang Compacts, she said, recognizing the armor configuration. I know their reputation. Expensive, efficient, utterly immoral. They don't take contracts they can't complete. Any weaknesses? They rely heavily on energy shields and coordinated tactics. Her tail swished thoughtfully. Disrupt their communication and they fall apart. But that gunship is the real problem. It's got enough firepower to crack this bunker open like an egg. Garrett was already pulling up schematics on his battered terminal. Years of salvage had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of ship classifications. The gunship was a Reaver class, heavy armor, multiple redundant systems, designed to survive sustained fire from planetary defense batteries. But nothing was invulnerable. I've got an idea, Garrett said slowly, but you're not going to like it. Try me. He zoomed in on the map, highlighting a section of the steel canyons about half a mile from their position. There's an old destroyer hull there, been barely balanced for years. The whole structure is unstable. One good shock, and the whole thing comes down. Silvera studied the terrain, her tactical mind already working through the implications. The gunship's downdraft. If we could lure it into that corridor, the wreckage collapses, takes down the gunship. Mercenaries lose their air support and probably half their troops when that hull comes down. And how do we lure a military-grade gunship into a narrow canyon? Silvara asked, though he felt that she already knew the answer. I need you to be bait. To her credit, Silvara didn't hesitate, didn't argue about the danger or demand alternative plans. She simply studied the map, calculating angles and timing with the precision of someone trained in warfare. I'll need a weapon, she said finally. Garrett led her to his armory. It was modest compared to what she was probably used to, but functional. He pulled out a kinetic rifle, checked the action, made sure the magazine was full, and handed it to her. She hefted it, getting a feel for the weight, the balance. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the safety testing, the trigger pull sighting down the barrel. You know how to use one of these? Garrett asked, though the answer was obvious. I was a duelist, remember? Her smile was sharp, predatory. I can adapt, though I prefer closer range. We'll save that for later, Garrett said. Right now, I need you fast and far. Draw them deep into the canyons, then double back here. I'll handle the cleanup. And if something goes wrong... He pulled her close, kissed her hard. He felt her surprise melt into pleasure, felt her body curve into his, like she was made to fit there. Then I'm coming for you, Garrett said against her mouth. No matter what, through fire and steel and anything else that gets in the way. Her smile was radiant. My savage human, always so protective. You're human, Garrett corrected. Yes, Silvara said softly, her hand over his heart. Mine. The bond goes both ways. Remember? The mercenaries' external speakers crackled to life, the sound echoing through the scrapyard's metal canyons. Empress Silvara, we know you're in there. Surrender now and your death will be quick. Silvara's response was to shoot out one of their cameras with the kinetic rifle. The shot was perfect, dead center, the camera exploding in a shower of sparks and shattered optics. I'll take that as a no, the mercenary leader said, his voice carrying a professional amusement. Bring up the siege weapons. That's our cue, Garrett said. He opened the bunker's emergency exit, and Silvera slipped out into the gray dawn. He felt her adrenaline spike through their connection, felt her calling on training she'd thought she'd never need again. She ran for the steel canyons, her tail streaming behind her like a battle standard, and the gunship followed. Garrett counted to 10, then activated the bunker's defenses. Automated turrets popped up from concealed positions, targeting the mercenaries with kinetic fire. Not enough to kill them all, they were too well armored for that, but enough to make them scatter, enough to divide their attention, enough to create chaos. He slipped out through another exit, moving through the wreckage like a ghost. The mercenaries were good, he could see that immediately. Professional, disciplined, but they were used to fighting in open spaces with clear lines of fire and established tactical doctrine. The scrapyard was his home, and he used every advantage it offered. The first mercenary died with a knife in his spine, never seeing Garrett coming. The body dropped silently, the kinetic dampeners in the armor actually working against the wearer by muffling the sound of the fall. The second got 3 rounds from Garrett's pistol before he could raise the alarm, the kinetic rounds punching through his energy shield like it wasn't there. The third managed to scream, but by then Garrett was already gone, melting back into the shadows between towering walls of stacked wreckage. Through their connection, he felt Silvera's triumph as the gunship followed her into the canyon. Felt her counting down, timing her escape with the precision of a duelist who'd spent years learning to measure distance and speed and split-second opportunities. The destroyer hull collapsed with a sound like the end of the world. 3 stories of solid metal, thousands of tons of plasteel and titanium and composites designed to withstand the vacuum of space came down in an avalanche that shook the earth and sent shockwaves rippling through the scrapyard. The gunship caught in the middle of the collapse never stood a chance. Its engines screamed, alarms wailed, and then it detonated in a ball of flame that turned night into day, the fusion reactor going critical, releasing energy that had been meant to power weapon systems into one catastrophic bloom of destruction. The shockwave knocked mercenaries off their feet, threw them against wreckage, shattered their careful formations into confusion and panic. And Garrett used that confusion like the weapon it was. His kinetic pistol barked again and again, each shot precise, each shot lethal. The mercenaries' shields were useless against physical projectiles, a fact that their training apparently hadn't prepared them for. They scattered, trying to find cover, trying to regroup, trying to understand why their supposedly invincible defenses were failing. By the time Silvera returned, running flat out with her tail streaming behind her and her eyes bright with adrenaline and triumph, 8 more mercenaries lay dead, and the rest had fled into the scrapyard's depths. How many, she panted, her chest heaving. 8 down in the chaos, Garrett reported, already scanning for stragglers. The rest scattered. They'll regroup, but it'll take time. He checked her over quickly, his hands professional but thorough, looking for wounds. You hurt. Just my pride, Silvera said, but she was smiling, fierce and satisfied and utterly alive in a way he'd never seen from her before. That canyon run was closer than I'd like, but I have to admit, she kissed him, tasting like adrenaline and triumph and the sharp tang of cordite. There's something exhilarating about being hunted. You're insane, Garrett muttered, but she could feel his relief, his pride in her performance, his growing affection that was becoming harder to deny. I'm claimed, Silvera corrected, and I'm beginning to enjoy this savage human lifestyle of yours. They made it back to the bunker without incident, but both knew this was just a reprieve. The mercenaries would be back, probably with reinforcements, probably with better intelligence about what they were facing. The Shadowfang Compact didn't fail contracts. They'd keep coming until they succeeded or ran out of resources. Inside the bunker's relative safety, Garrett pulled up the communication logs. Still no response from Admiral Corsa. Either she wasn't receiving or she couldn't respond. Neither option was encouraging. How long can we hold out? Silvera asked, reading his expression. Depends on what they bring next time, Garrett said, honestly. We've got ammunition, water, food for maybe a week if we're careful. Power's good for months. But if they bring serious hardware, orbital bombardment, or bunker busters, this place won't hold. It's tough, but it's not military grade. Silvera was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she moved closer, wrapping her arms around him from behind her tail, curling around his waist. He felt her fear, but also her determination, her refusal to give up, her absolute certainty that they would find a way through this. Then we make them bleed for every inch, she said quietly. We make it cost more than we're worth, and we survive long enough for Corsa to arrive. And if she doesn't, then we go down fighting. Together. But before either could say more, Garrett's communication array crackled to life. Not Admiral Corsa's encryption. Something else. A voice that made Silvera go rigid with recognition and rage. Silvera, my child. The voice was cultured, paternal, disappointed. What have you done to yourself? High Priest Vex Darkfur, her former mentor, the man who'd raised her from a cub, and the man who'd just tried to kill her. Garrett pulled up the signal trace. Broadcast from orbit. A ship had just entered the system. Big one, judging by the power signature. Still clinging to that human animal, Vex's voice continued. Still wallowing in the filth of the Anara. I had such hopes for you, child. Such plans. He sighed, the sound carrying a theatrical disappointment. But you forced my hand. The Aurora's dawn was meant to be a painless death. Quick. Merciful. Now you'll have to face the consequences of your choices. The communication cut off. Silvera's vision blurred. Memory crashed over her like a wave drowning present and past. She was 12 again, training yard. Wooden practice blade in her small hands slick with sweat and fear. Vex circling her with cold assessment, the kind of look you'd give faulty equipment. Again he commanded, "Your form is sloppy, and Empress cannot afford weakness." "I'm tired, Master Vex." Her voice was thin, desperate for approval for a moment of rest. His tail lashed out, striking her across the shoulders. Not hard enough to injure, just enough to remind, to control. An Empress is never tired, never weak, never less than perfect. He knelt before her, and his smile was gentle, loving, possessive all at once. "You are my masterpiece, little one. Everything I could never be. Do you understand? You belong to me. Your success is mine. Your failure is mine. Your choices are mine." Young Silvara had thought it was love, had craved that approval like air, had shaped herself into his vision because she didn't know there could be anything else. The memory shifted. Silvara at 16 presenting her first diplomatic proposal to the council. Pride swelling in her chest. She'd worked for weeks crafting something bold and innovative. Vex had smiled, then systematically dismantled it in front of everyone. Not to improve it, to remind her, to demonstrate that without him, she was nothing. She'd learned to run every decision through him first after that. Learned to be the Empress he wanted rather than the person she might have become. Another flash. Silvara at 20 discovering she had feelings for a young captain in the fleet. Someone kind. Someone who saw her as a person, not a crown. Vex had the captain transferred to the Outer Rim the next day. No explanation. No discussion. Just gone. The message was clear. Her heart belonged to him too. Present Silvara surfaced from the memories, gasping. Garrett's hands were on her shoulders, grounding her, his concern flooding through their bond. "He never saw me as a person," she whispered, the memories fading, but leaving scars. "Only as his creation, his legacy, his property to shape and control and display." Through their connection, Garrett felt the depth of that betrayal. The years of manipulation disguised as mentorship. The control masked as care. The theft of her agency presented as guidance. "Then we make sure he never owns you again," Garrett said. Silvera nodded, but her hands were shaking. Not with fear, with rage, cold and focused and dangerous. "He's coming here, to finish what the mercenaries couldn't, to reclaim his masterpiece." Her tail lashed, "or destroy it trying." The attack came at evening, not midnight. The sun was just beginning its descent when alarms shrieked through the bunker. Garrett and Silvera were already moving weapons in hand, the bonds singing with shared adrenaline. North wall Silvera said, her ears tracking sounds Garrett couldn't hear. Breaching charges. The explosion shook to the bunker's foundation. Garrett checked the security feeds and felt ice flood his veins. Crimson Guard, not mercenaries, not scavengers. Silvera's own elite troops flooding through the breach in formation so perfect it could have been a training exercise. Red armor gleaming in the emergency lighting. Weapons at the ready. Moving with the confidence of soldiers who'd never known defeat. "Your own troops," Garrett said, disbelief warring with tactical assessment. "Someone's turned them." Silvera's ears flattened completely against her skull, a gesture of pure rage. "The Crimson Guard. Commander Thex leads them." Her voice was tight with betrayal, with the sting of one more person she'd trusted proving unworthy of that trust. "Can you make them stand down?" "They're here to kill me, Garrett. They'll follow orders. And whoever gave those orders wants me dead." More explosions rattled the bunker. The Crimson Guard weren't messing around. They were cutting through his defenses like they were paper. Their military-grade equipment and training making short work of traps designed for scavengers and opportunistic mercenaries. Garrett grabbed his kinetic pistol, checked the magazine, slapped in a fresh one. "We need the escape tunnel." But plasma fire cut them off, the superheated bolts scorching the air where they'd been standing a second before. The Crimson Guard flooded into the main chamber, moving with lethal precision, cutting off every escape route with the efficiency of soldiers who'd trained for exactly this scenario. A stun grenade detonated. The world went white. Sound became pain. Balance became a distant concept. Garrett felt himself falling. Felt the hard impact of the metal floor. Felt consciousness trying to slip away through fingers that couldn't hold on. When awareness returned, he was on his knees. hands bound behind his back with military-grade restraints that bit into his wrists. 10 feet away, Silvera was held by 4 crimson guards. Her arms pinned her tail, lashing in fury. Through their connection, Garrett felt her terror. Not for herself, for him. A figure approached. Tall, scarred, older than most of the troops with fur graying at the muzzle and eyes that had seen too many battles. Commander Thex. The man carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd survived 1,000 conflicts and expected to survive 1,000 more. Your Majesty, Thex said, his voice carrying contempt that turned the honorific into an insult. How the mighty have fallen, consorting with lesser species in a salvager's hovel. Silvera's ears flattened completely. Commander Thex, I trusted you, gave you command of my personal guard. This is how you repay loyalty. Loyalty is to the Empire, Thex replied coldly. Not to an empress who defiles herself with animals. He nodded to one of his soldiers. Execute the human. Her Majesty will watch her pet die. Then High Priest Vex will cleanse her of this contamination. The guard raised a plasma rifle, pressing the barrel against Garrett's temple. Through their mandima, Silvera's terror exploded into something vast and primal. Her absolute refusal to let him die. Her rage at being helpless. Her love undeniable and overwhelming, crashing through both of them like a tidal wave. And that love, that fury, that desperate need to protect, reflected back through the bond. Multiplied, amplified by the connection between them until it became something more than either of them alone could generate. Everything went red. The military restraints weren't designed for a human running on adrenaline, augmented by an alien bond. Weren't designed for strength, fueled by rage, reflected and multiplied until it transcended normal biological limits. Garrett threw himself backward, slamming the guard into the wall with force that made bones audibly crunch. He rolled, kicked, grabbed the plasma rifle as it fell from nerveless fingers. The next 5 seconds were chaos. Garrett shot 2 guards point blank, the plasma bolts burning through armor at close range. A third guard lunged at him. Garrett gutted the man with a combat knife he didn't remember drawing, the blade finding the gap between chest plate and helmet with precision born of military training and desperate necessity. A fourth guard tried to tackle him. Garrett broke his neck with a twist-snap motion that was more instinct than conscious technique, all while roaring incoherently, the sound barely human, more animal than man. The remaining guards backed away, their discipline cracking in the face of something they didn't understand. This wasn't how humans fought. This wasn't possible. Commander Thex barely had time to raise his weapon before Garrett was on him. Fists and elbows and brutal, efficient violence. Each blow fueled by the bond-amplified rage, by the absolute certainty that this man had threatened his mate, by emotions too primal for words. You. Threatened. My mate. Each word punctuated by another strike. Silvera, freed by the chaos, ran to Garrett. Grabbed his fists mid-swing, her strength barely enough to stop him. Garrett, stop, I'm safe. You saved me. Through their connection, her safety flooded him. The red faded from his vision like morning fog burning away. He looked at his bloody knuckles, at Commander Thex's broken face, at the bodies scattered around the bunker. They were going to take you, he said, his voice rough, barely his own. She pulled him into a fierce kiss. Primal reassurance. Possessive claiming. He felt what she felt, awe at his ferocity, arousal at his violence in her defense, satisfaction that he'd proven himself willing to kill and die for her. What you did was magnificent, she whispered against his mouth. But right now we need answers. Commander Thex was still breathing, barely, coughing blood. Garrett knelt beside him, forcing his voice to something approaching calm, despite the fury still singing in his veins. Who's behind this? Just Vex, Thex laughed wetly, blood spattering across his armor. Lord Velkin Ashenmane, half the council. They want the old ways back, want the Empire pure again. He coughed, his body shuddering with the effort. High Priest Vex arrives in 90 minutes, flagship executioner, planetary bombardment class. Another wet cough, more blood. You can't win. He'll burn this whole scrapyard to ash before letting her escape. And when he has her, when he cleanses her of your taint. Thex's eyes found Silvera, and there was something like pity in them. The purification rite, ancient, unbreakable. You'll be bred to Lord Velkin until the animal's bond is overwritten, until you remember your place. He died with those words, and the silence that followed was heavy with implications. Heavy with the knowledge that this wasn't just about assassination anymore. It was about ownership, about breaking her will and reforming her into the perfect, obedient empress they'd always wanted. Silvara stood very still. Garrett felt her horror through their connection, her revulsion, her rage that was colder and more dangerous than the heat that had driven him to violence. "We need a miracle," she said quietly. Garrett looked at the bodies, at the wreckage of his bunker, at the woman who'd become more important than breathing in the space of a single day. "Then we make one," he said. He moved to his workshop, pulling out components he'd salvaged over years. Fusion core parts, capacitors, wiring. The pieces of a dozen different technologies cobbled together into something that might work, might explode. The odds were probably 50-50, but they were out of better options. "What is that?" Silvara asked, watching him work with fascinated horror. "EMP device?" Garrett set his hands moving with desperate speed and absolute focus. "Never tested. Theoretically, it should fry any electronic system within 100 meters, including a flagship's navigation and weapons. Theoretically, I need 10 minutes to finish it. And I need you to stall Vex when he arrives." "Garrett," I know, he interrupted, looking up at her. His hands were steady, but his eyes carried the weight of what he was asking. "I know it's dangerous. I know you shouldn't have to face him. But I need time, and you're the only one who can give it to me." She felt his certainty through their ond, his plan, his absolute determination to save her no matter the cost, his faith that she was strong enough to face the man who'd controlled her for so many years. "Then I'll give you time," Silvara said, her voice steady despite the fear. "I'm Empress. I don't hide from traitors." She walked toward the bunker's exit, and Garrett felt her fear through their connection. But he also felt her courage, her refusal to be a victim, her absolute trust that he would come through for her. He bent back to his work, his hands steady despite everything, and started building their miracle. The executioner descended like judgment from a poisoned sky. Silvara stood alone in the open ground before the bunker, watching the massive wedge-shaped hull materialize from the clouds. It bristled with enough weaponry to glass a continent. Crimson banners bearing Vex's personal sigil streamed from its flanks, ancient symbols that spoke of tradition and purity and the kind of fanaticism that had burned worlds throughout history. The landing ramp descended with pneumatic precision. Vex Darkfur emerged slowly, deliberately making her wait, making her feel small. It was a power play she'd seen him execute 1,000 times before. He was tall for a vulpine, his crimson fur graying at the muzzle in a way that spoke of age and experience. Ornate robes hung from his frame, ceremonial but functional, and his eyes carried the weight of zealotry tempered by decades of political maneuvering. 4 Crimson Guard elites flanked him, their armor pristine where Thex's troops had been battle-worn. These were the true believers, the ones who'd followed Vex out of conviction rather than orders. "Oh, child," Vex said, his voice carrying paternal disappointment that made Silvara's jaw clench. "What have you done to yourself?" She felt her heart clench despite everything. This man had raised her, had taught her strategy and honor and what it meant to lead, had been the father figure she'd never had, filling the void left by parents who died when she was young. "I've lived," Silvara replied, her voice steady through force of will. "Something you never let me do, Vex." The high priest descended the ramp, his movements measured and graceful despite his age. "I gave you everything, molded you from a grieving cub into the greatest empress our people have ever known, taught you wisdom, discipline, strength." He stopped 10 meters from her, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to maintain the illusion of respect. "And you threw it all away for an animal's touch." "Careful," Silvara said, her tail lashing. "That animal has a name, Garrett Thorne, and he's shown me more genuine care in a day than you did in 20 years. Vex's ears flattened. "Care you call this care? He's corrupted you with the NRA, that forbidden abomination that turns our people into slaves. The bond doesn't make slaves." Silvara shot back. "You do. Every decision filtered through your approval, every thought measured against your expectations, every moment of my life orchestrated by your vision of what I should be." She stepped forward, and Garrett felt her rage crystallizing into something cold and dangerous. "You didn't raise me, Vex. You built me, like one of Garrett's salvage projects. And the moment I showed signs of independent thought, you decided to scrap me." In the bunker, Garrett's hands flew over the EMP device. 7 minutes. He'd built it in 7 minutes, and every second had felt like eternity filtered through the bond's awareness of Silvera walking toward danger. 3 more minutes. Just 3 more. Through the surveillance feed, he watched Vex's face cycle through emotions. Hurt, anger, righteous indignation. The high priest was good at this, Garrett realized. Good at wearing masks, at manipulating emotions, at making his victims doubt themselves. I loved you, Vex said, and his voice carried genuine pain that made the lie more effective. Loved you like the daughter I never had. Everything I did was to protect you, to prepare you for the burden of the crown. You loved controlling me, Silvera corrected. Loved having your perfect creation to parade before the council. Loved the power that came from being the hand behind the throne. She moved closer, and Garrett felt through their bond that she was buying him time, deliberately drawing this out, giving him the minutes he needed. But I was never your daughter, Vex. I was your masterpiece, your legacy. And the moment I chose my own path, I stopped being valuable to you. That human stole you. Vex's composure cracked, his voice rising. That animal touched your sacred tail and invoked the NRA. You didn't choose this. You were claimed against your will. Wrong, Silvera's voice cut like a blade. He saved my life. The bond formed. And then I chose to accept it. Chose to complete it. Chose him over everything you tried to make me. 2 minutes. Vex's expression hardened. The mask of disappointed father fell away, revealing something colder underneath. Then you've doomed yourself. The council will never accept a human consort. The people will never follow an empress who defiles herself with lesser species. Then I'll change the council, Silvera said simply. Change the laws. Change what it means to be empress. With what authority? Vex laughed, bitter and sharp. You think your precious Admiral Corza will support this madness? Half the fleet follows me, child. Half the systems. You're isolated, alone, clinging to an animal who'll be dead within the hour. He gestured, and the Crimson Guard raised their weapons. Release the bond now, Silvera. Renounce this human. I'll be merciful. The purification rite will cleanse you, and we can forget this ever happened. 1 minute. Silvera looked back toward the bunker. Garrett couldn't see her face through the surveillance feed, but through their connection, he felt what she felt. Love, certainty, absolute refusal to abandon what they'd found. No, she said simply. Vex pulled a device from his robes. Small, innocuous, deadly. I anticipated your stubbornness. The bunker is rigged with plasma charges. I trigger this, everything within 200 meters vaporizes. You're human, you. All of it erased like it never existed. The EMP was ready. Garrett grabbed it, a crude cylinder of salvage tech that hummed with barely contained energy, and ran for the exit. Let her go, Vex, Garrett shouted, emerging into the open. I'm the one you want dead. The high priest's gaze fixed on him, and Garrett saw genuine hatred there. Not the cold calculation of a politician. Pure, burning loathing. The animal speaks, Vex said. Tell me, human, do you understand what you've done? You've destroyed perfection. Corrupted the greatest leader our people have ever known. Reduced her to a slave of biological compulsion. I pulled her from Wreckage, Garrett replied. Moving closer, the EMP, hidden behind his back, saved her life. Everything else was her choice. Choice, Vex laughed. The Inara removes choice. It makes the claimed into property. Then explain why I can release her, Garrett said. Silvera's head snapped toward him. Through their connection, he felt her sudden terror, her realization of what he was about to do. Garrett, no. By right of savior, Garrett continued, his voice formal, reaching for words he didn't know but the bond supplied. I release Empress Silvera Night Whisper from the Anara soul bond. She is free. The bond dissolved. The sensation was agony, like having part of his soul ripped away. The connection that had become as natural as breathing simply ceased, leaving a void that hurt more than any physical wound. Garrett gasped, dropping to one knee, feeling the absence of her like amputation. 10 feet away, Silvera collapsed, tears streaming down her face, her hands clutching at her chest where the bond had lived. I don't want to be free, she screamed. I don't want this. Vex stood frozen, his device forgotten, staring at them both with incomprehension. Impossible. Released bonds don't reform. It's over. She's free of your taint. But Garrett was standing, moving toward Silvera with desperate purpose. And she was moving toward him, crawling when her legs wouldn't support her, reaching for him with hands that trembled. And I choose you. Garrett said, his voice rough with pain and absolute certainty. Not because magic said so, because you're worth everything. I choose you. Silvera echoed, her hand finding his. Not because I'm claimed, because I love you. Their fingers touched. The bond snapped back into existence with force that drove them both to their knees. But this time it was different, stronger, permanent in a way that transcended biology, woven from choice and love, and the absolute certainty that they were meant to be together. Through the reformed bond, they felt each other's truth. No compulsion, no magic forcing their hands, just two people who'd found something precious and refused to let it go. Vex staggered backward. Impossible. That's not how the Anara works. Maybe, Silvara said, rising with Garrett's help, their hands still linked. It was never just the Anara. Maybe love was always the stronger bond. The sky split open, warships dropped from the clouds, their hulls bearing the insignia of the Crimson Fleet. 15 vessels ranging from corvettes to battlecruisers forming a perimeter around the Executioner with the precision of a well-executed tactical maneuver. The flagship Valiant Dawn descended, dwarfing Vex's vessel, its weapons arrays tracking the Executioner with obvious threat. Vex looked up in horror. No, Korza wouldn't support her childhood friend. Admiral Korza, Steelheart's voice boomed across open channels, wouldn't defend her empress against treason. You always did underestimate loyalty, Vex. Distracted, his guard down. Vex never saw Silvara move. She crossed the distance between them in a blur of vulpine speed, her duelist training resurfacing after years of dormancy. Her claws extended sharp and deadly, pressing against Vex's throat, hard enough to draw blood. Drop it, she commanded. The dead man's switch fell from nerveless fingers. Garrett caught it before it hit the ground, his reflexes born of combat engineering, preventing the impact detonation that would have killed them all. The Crimson Guard elites lowered their weapons, recognizing defeat when they saw it. It's over, Vex, Silvera said quietly. You're under arrest for treason, attempted regicide, conspiracy to commit murder. The Council will decide your fate. The Council will never accept your human. Vex said, even in defeat, clinging to his certainty. They'll tear you apart for this. Then I'll change the Council, Silvera replied. One way or another, the Valiant Dawn's landing bay was vast enough to swallow Garrett's entire bunker with room to spare. He stood beside Silvara as Admiral Korza Steelheart approached the older Vulpine, silver fur and battle scars, speaking of a lifetime spent in military service. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, but warm when they landed on Silvara. Korza embraced Silvara fiercely, and Garrett felt his mate's relief at seeing her oldest friend alive and loyal. You're alive, Korza said, pulling back to study Silvera's face with the practiced eye of someone who'd known her since childhood. Thank the stars. When we got your distress call, when we saw the Aurora's dawn destroyed, Garrett kept me alive, Silvera said, reaching back to take his hand. Garrett Thorne, my bonded mate. Korza's gaze shifted to Garrett, and he saw the assessment there. The calculation of a military mind measuring threat and value. The protective instinct of a friend evaluating whether this human was worthy. Then surprisingly, she smiled. You have the Crimson Fleet's gratitude human. You saved our Empress when we failed to protect her. She paused, her smile turning wry. You've also created the biggest political shitstorm in 300 years. The Council is already convening emergency sessions. Half of them want to try Silvara for violating the Anara prohibition. The other half want to execute you for corrupting her. Looking forward to it, Garrett said dryly. The journey to the capital took 3 days. 3 days aboard a warship where Silvera's presence drew constant attention. Some crew members were respectful, offering quiet congratulations and carefully neutral expressions that didn't quite hide their curiosity. Others were hostile, their body language screaming disapproval, even when their mouths stayed silent. Garrett heard the whispers, saw the looks. Through it all, Silvera stayed close to Garrett, not 2 steps behind anymore. The bond had evolved after their choice becoming something that allowed distance without pain. But she chose proximity anyway, and Garrett found he preferred it that way. Partners facing the storm together. The capital station hung in orbit above a gas giant, a massive ring structure that housed 50 million Vulpine. The Grand Council chamber was at its heart a holographic hall where representatives from 12 star systems gathered to govern an empire that spanned light years. Garrett stood in that chamber, uncomfortably aware of being the only human in a sea of Vulpine faces. thousands of eyes tracking his every movement. Silvara stood beside him, dressed in full imperial regalia, her crown catching the light, her posture radiating authority that had been earned through years of leadership. Vex knelt in the prisoner's dock, shackled but defiant. Even in chains, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who believed history would vindicate him. The charges were read by a council clerk whose voice echoed through the chamber. Treason, attempted regicide, conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Commander Thex's dying confession, intercepted communications, the testimony of mercenaries who'd been captured in the scrapyard and offered immunity in exchange for cooperation. But Lord Velkin Ashenmane stood, his elderly frame still commanding, despite his age, his missing eye and scarred face testament to a warrior's life. He leaned on a ceremonial staff, but Garrett suspected the old Vulpine could still be dangerous if provoked. High Priest Vex acted rashly. Velkin said, his voice carrying across the chamber with practiced projection. But his concern was valid. Empress Silvara has violated our most sacred prohibition. The Anara bond was forbidden for good reason. He gestured toward Garrett with contempt barely concealed behind diplomatic language. She has defiled herself with a lesser species, contaminated the imperial bloodline, brought shame to 12 systems. The traditionalist faction, 5 representatives, strong applauded. The sound echoed through the chamber, and Garrett felt Silvara's hand tighten on his. Ambassador Lara, a brown-furred female with the bearing of a scientist and the fire of a reformer, rose in opposition. The Empress's personal life is her sovereignty. We have no right to dictate whom she bonds with. We have every right. Velkin countered, his voice rising with righteous indignation when her choices affect the stability of the Empire. Ancient Law Section 12 allows the Council to contest improper bonds through trial by combat. The chamber erupted into argument, voices rising, some in support of tradition, others demanding progress. Through their connection, Garrett felt Silvara's frustration, her anger at being reduced to a political football, her determination to fight this to the bitter end. Velkin raised his hand for silence, and the chamber gradually quieted. I invoke trial by combat. I name as champion Rexar Ironpelt, defender of tradition. A door opened at the far end of the chamber, and Rexar entered. He was massive. 7 feet of solid muscle covered in silver-blue fur that seemed to ripple with each movement. His eyes carried the flat certainty of a killer who'd never known defeat. Scars crisscrossed his body, each one a story of violence survived and opponents defeated. Around his waist hung twin plasma blades, their hilts worn smooth by years of use. Rexar Ironpelt, Velkin announced with obvious satisfaction. 47 duels, 47 victories, 22 kills. He has never lost, has never shown mercy. He is tradition's answer to corruption. Silvara stepped forward. I'll fight my own. The Empress cannot. Velkin interrupted smoothly. Conflict of interest. Ancient law is clear. Name your champion or forfeit the bond. Garrett felt her panic through their connection, felt her desperate calculation of odds, felt her certainty that no one could defeat Rexar in single combat. The champion was too experienced, too skilled, too utterly without conscience or mercy. He stepped forward. I'll fight for her. The chamber exploded into noise. Laughter, outrage, disbelief. A human challenging the greatest Vulpine warrior alive. It was absurd, suicidal, impossible. Velkin's smile was predatory, the expression of a man who'd already won. A human against Rexar, this will be a slaughter. Then it'll be a short fight, Garrett replied calmly. When do we start? Terms were set with the precision of ancient ritual. 48 hours to prepare. The Grand Colosseum for the venue. First blood to incapacitation or yield. Death optional but honored by tradition. The duel would be broadcast across 12 systems. Billions would watch a human face the greatest warrior the Vulpine had ever produced. Most expected it to be an execution. In the training rooms beneath the Colosseum, Admiral Corza worked with Garrett, teaching him what she could in the limited time they had. He's faster than you, she said bluntly, pulling no punches. Stronger, has claws and fangs and a lifetime of combat experience. You have, what exactly? Stubbornness, Garrett replied, studying holographic replays of Rexar's previous duels. The champion moved like water, like death, given form and purpose. Tactics, weapons training, and I fight dirty. That won't be enough. Then I'll make it enough, Korza sighed, but there was grudging respect in her eyes. At least you're not delusional about your chances. That's something. They worked through basic Vulpine combat theory, how to read stance, how to anticipate strikes, how to survive long enough to find an opening. Garrett absorbed it all with the focus of someone who knew his life depended on every detail. At night, Silvera came to him. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. Through their bond, everything was already said. The fear, the determination, the absolute refusal to give up even when the odds were impossible. She taught him the subtleties of Vulpine combat that couldn't be learned from holographic recordings, the tells that preceded strikes, the body language that revealed intent. Tail position she explained, demonstrating with her own magnificent tail. Low and left means right hand/incoming. Centered and rigid means forward lunge. Swishing means uncertainty, searching for opening. And when he goes quadrupedal, faster but less precise. She dropped to all fours, showing him the stance. Can't use weapons. More animal, less soldier. Watch the shoulders. They telegraph direction better than the tail in animal form. They sparred her dulled claws, teaching him to read her movements, to anticipate rather than react. And when the sparring turned to other things, when combat became intimacy and strategy became connection, neither of them spoke of the possibility that this might be their last night together. The Grand Coliseum held 50,000 spectators, and every seat was filled. The noise was deafening, a wall of sound that pressed against Garrett's consciousness. Chants of Rexar competing with smaller pockets of Silvera, and the occasional defiant Garrett entered the arena wearing minimal armor. Kinetic rifle slung across his back. Combat knife at his hip. No energy shields. No sophisticated defenses. Just speed and skill, and the willingness to do whatever it took to win. The arena floor was packed sand over metal, designed to show blood, to make every wound visible to the crowd. Pillars rose at intervals, remnants of some ancient architectural style, providing cover and tactical options. Rexar entered from the opposite gate, and the crowd's roar intensified to something almost physical. 7 feet of predatory grace. Silver blue fur rippling over muscle that looked like it had been carved from stone. Twin plasma blades igniting with a hum that promised death. The announcer's voice boomed across the Coliseum, amplified to reach every ear. Trial by combat to determine bond validity. Champion Rexar, Iron Pelt defender of tradition, faces challenger Garrett Thorne, bonded mate of Empress Silvera. First blood to incapacitation or yield. Death is permitted. Begin, the bell rang. Rexar charged a blur of speed that defied belief, that made Garrett's combat-trained reflexes feel slow and inadequate. Garrett shot him. The kinetic round grazed Rexar's shoulder, drawing first blood technically, but the rules required incapacitation or yield. The fight continued. The crowd howled in outrage at the pre-contact shot. You shot me before honor contact. Rexar's voice carried genuine shock, as if he couldn't believe someone would violate the unspoken rules of engagement. I'm human, Garrett shouted back, already moving, already calculating. We don't fight fair. We fight to win. Rexar's expression shifted from shock to rage, and Garrett realized he'd just made the champion angry. Made this personal instead of professional. Not his best tactical decision. Rexar closed the distance, plasma blades whirling in patterns too fast to follow, creating a web of superheated death. Garrett dodged, barely feeling the heat wash over him as the plasma scorched the air. One blade caught his shoulder, and the pain was immediate and intense, but adrenaline dulled it to a distant ache. Garrett grabbed a handful of arena sand and threw it in Rexar's eyes. The crowd booed, screamed about dishonor, about cowardice. But Garrett didn't care. He'd learned long ago in the Navy that survival mattered more than approval. That honor was a luxury reserved for people who weren't about to die. Rexar wiped his eyes, snarling with rage that had transcended mere anger. He dropped one plasma blade and went quadrupedal, his body shifting into something more animal than humanoid. On 4 legs, he was faster than anything Garrett had ever seen. A silver-blue streak that his eyes couldn't track, could barely register. Claws raked across Garrett's ribs. Blood flowed hot and red, soaking into his shirt. Another slash across his thigh, deep enough that his leg nearly gave out, that sent him stumbling. His rifle clattered away, knocked from nerveless fingers by a tail swipe he never saw coming. Garrett was losing, bleeding. his vision narrowing at the edges. Through their bond, he felt Silvera's anguish, sharp and terrible. Her desperate need to help. Her hatred of being powerless to do anything but watch. And then through that same bond, something else. Not words, not instructions, just awareness flowing between them like water finding its level. Tail twitching left, he's going right. Garrett moved right without conscious thought, and Rexar's lunge missed by inches, claws scoring sand instead of flesh. Ears back, defensive feint. Garrett didn't take the bait, and Rexar's counterstrike hit empty air instead of vulnerable organs. Pupils wide, pounce incoming. Garrett was already moving using a pillar for cover, and Rexar's attack shattered stone instead of bone, sending fragments flying. Through their bond, Silvera was feeding him her duelist's instincts, her lifetime of combat training, her ability to read vulpine body language like a scholar reads ancient texts. And Garrett was learning, adapting, predicting movements before they happened, turning the fight from reaction to anticipation. The crowd's jeers turned to confused muttering. How was the human anticipating the champion? How was he reading movements that should be impossible for an alien species to predict? Rexar, frustrated by an opponent who kept defying expectations, abandoned defense entirely. Pure aggression. All-out assault. No holding back, no strategy beyond overwhelming force and speed. And Garrett countered perfectly. He'd spent 7 years learning to use the environment, to turn terrain into weapon, to make the scrapyard work for him instead of against him. The arena was just another battlefield. He used Rexar's momentum against him, redirecting rather than blocking. 7 feet of muscle and fury met immovable leverage at the perfect angle, and physics did the rest. Rexar flew into the arena wall, the impact cracking stone, sending spiderweb fractures spreading across ancient masonry. Garrett was on him in an instant, moving through pain and exhaustion on pure adrenaline and determination. Knee on spine, combat knife to throat. The blade pressed against fur and flesh, one motion away from ending this. Yield. Rexar's eyes were wide with shock, with disbelief that bordered on incomprehension. Never. Kill me or I continue. I won't yield to a lesser species. Through their bond, Garrett felt Silvera's conflict. She didn't want him to become a killer for her. Didn't want him to cross that line to carry that weight. He'd killed in combat and defense, but this would be different. This would be execution. He lowered the knife from Rexar's throat. I won't kill an honorable opponent. Garrett started to withdraw, to step back and find another way to force submission. Rexar lunged in a dishonorable surprise attack, his warrior's code abandoned in favor of desperate survival. Garrett shot his weapon hand. The kinetic rounds shattered bones, and Rexar's plasma blade fell from nerveless fingers, deactivating as it hit the sand. The champion collapsed, howling with pain and rage and the bitter taste of defeat. Garrett kicked the blade away, stood over him with the kind of presence that came from absolute certainty. You fought with honor until that. Don't die with stubbornness. Yield, warrior. Rexar stared up at him, genuine shock replacing the rage in his eyes. No one had ever offered him mercy. No one had ever called him warrior with respect after defeating him. In 47 duels, it had always been kill or be killed. Slowly, painfully, his pride warring with pragmatism. Rexar nodded. I yield. The arena exploded, half the crowd cheering, their voices rising in triumph and disbelief, half screaming in outrage, unable to accept what they just witnessed. And in the royal box, Silvera stood with tears streaming down her face, one hand over her heart, where their bonds sang with triumph and relief and love, so vast it hurt. The council reconvened immediately, the chamber buzzing with energy and tension. The traditionalists were screaming about trickery, about bond manipulation, about dishonor that invalidated the results. The progressives were countering with equal volume, citing ancient precedent in the letter of the law. Lord Velkin stood, his face twisted with rage, barely contained behind diplomatic language. He won through the bond, through alien contamination of pure combat. The trial is invalid. He won through skill. Ambassador Lyra shot back, her voice cutting through the chaos. Through mercy that our traditions claim to value, but rarely show, the law is clear. First blood to incapacitation or yield. The human met both conditions. The argument raged like a storm, voices rising and falling, accusations flying. 6 votes for accepting the bond, 6 votes against. A tie that threatened to tear the council apart. Velkin smiled, preparing to invoke the tiebreaker that would void the beam-on despite Garrett's victory that would reduce everything they'd fought for to political maneuvering. But Rexar entered the chamber, his hands splinted and bandaged, his pride battered, but his honor intact. "I invoke right of Victor's testimony," the champion said, his voice carrying despite his injuries. The chamber fell silent. Ancient law granted the defeated combatant the right to speak at judgment, a tradition so old that most had forgotten it existed. "I fought to defend tradition." Rexar continued, his words careful and deliberate. "To preserve what we were. To protect the purity of our people and our ways." He looked at Garrett, and there was something new in his eyes. Respect earned through combat, through the kind of understanding that only comes from facing someone in battle. "But the human showed me something I'd forgotten. He beat me because he fought for something, not against someone. Because he had something worth fighting for beyond duty, or honor, or tradition." Rexar's gaze swept across the council chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives who'd watched him kill for decades. "I recommend the council accept this bond, or admit that our tradition is hollow, that we value rules more than the people they're meant to serve, that we've forgotten what it means to fight for love instead of against change." He sat his testimony complete, and the chamber erupted into fresh argument. But something had shifted. Something fundamental about the debate had changed with Rexar's words. Silvara rose from her throne, and the chamber gradually quieted. Her crown caught the light, but it was her presence that commanded attention. The bearing of someone who'd been born to lead, but had learned to earn it. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "I invoke imperial decree, the emergency power rarely used that allowed an empress to override council vote in times of crisis, to act unilaterally when the system threatened to paralyze itself. The Inara bond is no longer forbidden. It is honored when chosen freely. Our empire will reflect that love transcends species. That choice matters more than law, written in fear centuries ago. That progress requires courage." She looked across the chamber, meeting the eyes of each representative, challenging them to stand with her or against her. "Any who disagree may leave the council. I will not force unity, but I will not compromise on this." Three traditionalist representatives stood and walked out, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The chamber held its breath, waiting to see if more would follow, if the empire would fracture over this moment. But the others remained, some convinced, some uncertain, some simply unwilling to abandon their posts. 9-3 in favor of the new order. The bond was recognized. Garrett was accepted as consort, and the Vulpine Empire took its first stumbling steps into a future that looked nothing like its past. Vex, watching from his prisoner's dock, finally broke. The mask he'd worn for so long cracked, completely revealing the broken old man underneath. "You were my greatest student," he whispered, his voice carrying in the silence. "And my greatest failure." "No," Silvera said coldly, looking at the man who'd shaped her childhood and tried to destroy her adulthood. "Your failure was thinking tradition mattered more than the people it serves. That control was love. That you owned me instead of guiding me." She turned away from him, from the pathetic figure in chains, and took Garrett's hand. "Take him to the Outer Rim penal colony. Strip him of all titles and honors. He's nothing now." As guards led Vex away, Silvera and Garrett walked from the chamber together. Partners, equals, bonded not just by ancient magic but by choice renewed every moment they drew breath. A week later, the coronation ceremony transformed the Grand Hall into something beautiful. Flowers from a dozen worlds, their scents mingling in the air. Music that blended Vulpine and human traditions into something new and strange and oddly harmonious. 40,000 attendees packed the hall, and billions watching across 12 systems through holographic broadcast. Awesome. Garrett stood in ceremonial armor, a blend of his old Navy dress uniform and Vulpine royal regalia. His medals from military service hung beside newly granted honors from the Vulpine Empire. He looked uncomfortable and proud in equal measure, a man who'd never sought recognition but wouldn't dishonor it by refusing. Silvera wore her full imperial crown, her robes flowing like water, her tail decorated with jewelry that highlighted the luminescent white tip. She'd never looked more beautiful or more formidable, and Garrett felt his breath catch as he looked at her. Admiral Corza officiated, her voice carrying across the vast hall with the authority of rank and the warmth of friendship. "We gather to recognize a bond forged in fire and proven through choice. to honor love that transcends species and circumstance, to witness the coronation of a consort chosen not by tradition, but by the heart of our empress. Garrett spoke his vows, his voice steady despite 40,000 eyes watching. I vow to stand beside you, not behind or ahead, to be your partner in everything, to challenge you when you're wrong, support you when you're right, and love you through everything between. I vow to serve not the crown, but the person who wears it, to remember that before you were empress, you were Silvara, and that's who I choose, every day, for as long as I draw breath. Silvara's vows came next, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I vow to follow you into danger, lead you in politics, and walk with you through both, to honor the man who pulled me from wreckage and showed me what freedom truly means. Two souls, one bond, infinite stars to explore together. I choose you, Garrett Thorne, not because the Inara claimed you, but because my heart recognizes its home. By the Inara Eternal and Council Decree, Korza announced I recognize this bond. I present Garrett Thorne consort to the Empress. May his wisdom guide us. May his courage inspire us. May his love remind us what we fight for. The applause was mixed, some genuine rising from people who believed in what this union represented, some polite the bare minimum required by protocol, some absent entirely empty seats where traditionalists had refused to attend. But it was enough. It was beginning. Garrett's first act as consort was to propose the Interspecies Governance Council, an institution that would grant equal representation to human colonies and other species within Vulpine space, a radical restructuring of power that had been unthinkable a week ago. Silvara supported it immediately, her voice brooking no argument. Let this be our first reform. Let it demonstrate that strength comes from diversity, not purity. Let it be so. The weeks following the coronation were chaos tempered by cautious optimism. 3 council seats needed filling after the traditionalist resignations. Ambassador Lyra proposed candidates from progressive factions, younger Vulpine, who'd grown up in a galaxy where species intermingled freely, where the old certainties no longer applied. Rexar Ironpelt, his hand healed, but forever scarred by Garrett's bullet-requested audience with Silvera. Garrett stood beside her as the champion entered the throne room, his posture respectful but not submissive. I fought for tradition because it was all I knew, Rexar said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Because I was taught that our way was the only way. You showed me something better. Purpose beyond duty, meaning beyond violence. He looked at Garrett with something that might have been the beginning of friendship. I request permission to serve as combat instructor for the new Interspecies Defense Force, to teach the next generation to fight with honor and mercy, to be warriors instead of just killers. Silvara smiled, genuine warmth in her expression. Granted, teach them well, champion. Teach them that strength and compassion aren't opposites, that the greatest warriors fight for something worth preserving. Lord Velkin Ashenmane's fate was decided by council vote, a lengthy debate that revealed the fault lines still running through the empire. Exiled to the outer colonies, stripped of titles and holdings, but not imprisoned. A mercy some called too generous. Let him see the diversity he despised, Silvara declared when announcing the sentence. Let him live among the species he called lesser. Let him learn that strength comes in many forms. And if he cannot learn, let him at least cause no further harm. The Interspecies Governance Council convened for the first time 3 months after the coronation. Humans, Vulpine, and 6 other species represented their delegates, gathering in a chamber built for this new era. Arguments were fierce compromises, hard-won progress measured in inches rather than miles. But it was progress. And through it all, Silvera felt Garrett beside her. Not 2 steps behind anymore. Not leading from ahead. Beside her in the truest sense. Partners navigating uncharted territory together. When the medical scans confirmed the pregnancy both possible and dangerous, they faced that challenge together too. The physician, a Vulpine specialist in xenobiology, delivered the news with careful professional detachment. The pregnancy is viable, she said, studying holographic displays that showed something unprecedented. But complications are likely, extremely likely. We have no precedent for Vulpine-human hybrid development. No baseline for what's normal versus what's dangerous. We're navigating blindly. Silvara's hand found Garrett's, their fingers lacing together with the ease of constant practice. Then we navigate together, she said simply. Through their bond, Garrett felt her fear mixed with hope, her uncertainty balanced by determination. Whatever comes, Garrett added, we face it like we've faced everything else. Together, the physician nodded, making notes. I'll monitor closely. Daily scans for the first trimester. We'll need to... She paused, looking at them with something that might have been envy. You two are writing the medical textbook on this. Future generations will study what we learn here. Then we'd better make it a good story, Silvara said. 6 months later, they returned to Nexus 7. Silvara was visibly pregnant, now her hand resting protectively on the swell of her belly, where their child grew. The pregnancy had been complicated, requiring constant monitoring and twice-weekly medical interventions. But mother and child were healthy, thriving even, creating something new that had never existed before. They walked through the scrapyard, hand in hand, Silvara still following close, but now Garrett followed her just as closely. The bond had evolved into something beautiful, a partnership that flowed both ways, neither leading nor following, but moving together. The bunker had been cleaned, repaired, expanded into something between retreat and monument. They'd added a clear dome that let them see the stars, had installed proper atmospheric processors that slowly turned poison into breathable air. They spent a week there, away from the demands of the Empire, away from council politics and public scrutiny. Just two people who'd found each other in Wreckage and built something worth preserving. Do you regret it? Silvara asked one evening, watching the purple sunset through the viewport they'd installed. The chaos, the politics. Losing your quiet life, her tail was wrapped around them both, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. I regret nothing, Garrett said, his hand joining hers on her belly, where something moved beneath the surface. Their child, restless and active, already making its presence known. I regret not crashing sooner, Silvara said, and they laughed together, the sound easy and warm and full of affection earned through trials survived. Garrett taught her to weld, though she was terrible at it, and laughed at her own mistakes with the kind of self-deprecating humor she'd never been allowed as Empress. Silvara taught him Vulpine star navigation, and he was surprisingly good at the spatial mathematics involved, seeing patterns in the chaos of stellar drift. They rebuilt the bunker together, transforming it from a survivor's bolt hole into a home, a place where they could be themselves without the weight of crowns or expectations. Where Silvara could just be Silvara, and Garrett could just be Garrett, and the bond between them could simply exist without politics or protocol. On their last night before returning to the capital, they sat outside watching stars appear in Nexus 7's clearing sky. The atmospheric processors they donated were slowly purifying the air, turning poison into promise, transforming a graveyard into something that might someday bloom. Silvara's hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the life moving within. Half human, half Vulpine. Wholly theirs. Garrett's hand covered hers, and through their bond, they felt their child's heartbeat. Strong, steady, alive and growing and full of potential. What do you think? Garrett asked, his voice soft with wonder. Boy or girl, doesn't matter, Silvara said. As long as they're healthy, as long as they know they're loved, as long as they grow up in a galaxy where bonds like ours are celebrated instead of forbidden. Still follow me everywhere, you know? Garrett teased his thumb, tracing circles on her belly. And you follow me right back, Silvara countered, leaning into him. That's not how the Anara is supposed to work. Maybe we're doing it better. She turned to look at him, her amber eyes reflecting starlight, and kissed him with tenderness that transcended passion. Through their appointment, he felt her contentment, her certainty, her love chosen and rechosen, every day stronger for being freely given. We definitely are, she whispered. Above them, a shooting star streaked across the sky, trailing fire through atmosphere that was slowly healing. Silvara made a wish, though, with Garrett beside her, with their child growing within her, with an empire slowly learning that love transcended species and circumstance. She couldn't think of anything she still needed. She had everything that mattered. In the distance, ships descended toward the scrapyard. Not enemies this time. Engineers and workers coming to help transform Nexus 7 from graveyard to sanctuary, to build something new from the wreckage of what had been. The Empire's work was never done. Challenges remained. Political enemies still plotted in shadows. The future was uncertain, full of obstacles and opposition, and the constant struggle to make progress against the weight of tradition. But Garrett and Silvera faced it together, bonded not by ancient magic alone, but by something stronger. By the choice they made every morning to love each other, to stand together, to build a future worthy of the trials they'd survived. He'd pulled an empress from wreckage by her tail. She'd followed him everywhere. He'd followed her right back. And together they proved that love chosen freely was the strongest bond of all. Stronger than tradition, stronger than law, stronger than the forces that sought to tear them apart. They built an empire on that foundation, not on fear or purity or the desperate clinging to a past that had never been as golden as memory painted it, but on love, on choice, on the radical notion that strength came from diversity, that progress required courage, and that the future belonged to those brave enough to reach for it. The stars wheeled overhead, infinite and eternal, bearing witness to two souls who'd found each other in fire and chaos and chosen to stay together through everything that followed it. Their bond hummed between them, a constant reminder that they were never alone, that they'd found something precious in the wreckage, that sometimes the best things in life begin with a desperate rescue and a tail pull, in a connection that defies every rational explanation but feels more real than anything else in the universe. Garrett Thorne had pulled Empress Silvara Night Whisper from wreckage by her tail. She followed him everywhere. He followed her right back. And together, wrapped in starlight, in each other, they built a love that would echo through generations. A bond that would inspire others to reach across differences and find connection. A story that would be told and retold until it became legend. The Salvager and the Empress. The human and the Vulpine. The bond that changed an empire. It started with wreckage and fire, in a moment of desperate heroism. It became something far more precious. It became love.